In this episode of our course on the book of Revelation, we begin part 6, where we'll be looking at the political and economic critique that John the author and that the book as a whole levels in its own context, first century Asia Minor, against the Roman Empire. Now, one of the things that we want to be careful about as we go through this particular part of Revelation is that we don't get so locked in on first century Rome that we lose sight of the fact that for John, there are larger cosmic powers at work behind the political rulers, the economic leaders, and the religious priests and delegates of the first century world. So while it's important to recognize that John does have specific events, people, places in mind, he's also telling a much larger story. What's really helpful about that for us at this point in the course is that it will not only be interesting and informative for us to know some of the connections to the first century world, but if we keep tracking with the larger story, we can also begin to make applications and interpretations of realities in our own world. And I think that, at the end of the day, was the pastoral purpose of John as he wrote this text. It was intended prophetically to have something to say to his audience, his hearers and readers in their first century world, and the apocalypse, I believe, can still function that way today. We've just finished in part 5 looking at Revelation 10 and 11 as a comprehensive overview of how faithful witness functions to bring about repentance and God's good kingdom of peace. And now we move into chapters 12 and 13. And if you remember back to the early moments in part 2, when we talked about the structure of the book of Revelation, I made the observation that there are two really critical sources for theological grounding in the book. The first, chapter 4 and 5, the vision of the heavenly court, the heavenly kingdom, and God's full presence on view in that cosmic setting. But the second major area identified was precisely where we are now, chapters 12 and 13. We've already familiarized ourselves with the opening lines of chapter 12. You'll remember back when I was working through a brief description of how apocalyptic literature works, I actually used Revelation 12 alongside Matthew 2 to illustrate how one could retell real-life historical events in the form of an apocalypse. So one of the questions I want to ask as we come back to chapter 12 now is, where does this idea, where does the storyline and the application of it come to John when he begins to tell the account of a dragon and beasts and cosmic war? Where does all of that come from? And in order to do that, I would encourage you to read through Revelation 12, and also follow along as we look at 3 different passages from the Old Testament which help inform the imagery and the perspective that John endorses in chapter 12. If you've had a chance to read chapter 12, what I would like to do now is give you a little bit of background to dragon or serpent language in biblical texts. It may surprise you that embedded at various points in the Hebrew Scriptures, ancient Israelite authors were very willing and prepared to take on, to tell, and even to subvert the stories of other people groups, civilizations, and cultures in their accounting of things. And one of the very common motifs in the ancient Near East was that people would refer to a leviathan or a sea serpent, a dragon type of figure that was part of the created order or that was perhaps antagonistic to the order of creation. So rather than the ancient Israelite authors saying, you know what, that whole dragon, serpent, leviathan stuff, that's a bunch of garbage. Rather than saying that, these authors actually stepped into that, leaned into those narratives, and retold them from the perspective